Hello, I'm Jamillah Knowles, and today I'm going to be talking about emerging technologies and their risks. My guest today is Andrew Burgess, who's an artificial intelligence expert. And so we're going to get into some of the ins and outs of whether or not this emerging technology is going to be beneficial. So, Andrew, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself so that we understand where you're coming from.
Thank you. So I'm an independent expert on artificial intelligence and also robotic process automation. I've been doing this for the last 5 years or so. I'm just in the process as well of building a new consultancy called Greenhouse Intelligence. Again, focusing on artificial intelligence, but more on the delivery side. Typically I go into businesses and help them create their artificial intelligence strategy.
Excellent. So artificial intelligence is certainly a buzzword at the moment. It gets bandied around, sometimes used even when there isn't any AI involved.
Yes.
But what are the risks associated with this technology, and indeed, what are the sort of false flags, if there were?
Yeah, so you're right. There's massive amount of hype at the moment around AI, and a lot of it confuses people and scares them, and people are fearful of what they don't understand. So I think understanding AI is a really important part of what executives need to do. But understanding the risks as well is just important. And there's a range of different risks around AI. Some of the most famous ones, things like the black box effect. And the idea here is that the AI essentially is making decisions that you don't know why it's made that decision. So that works because typically in a machine learning environment, the model is fed lots of data, and it builds a model based on the data it's trained on. So this is the machine doing the learning, where we get machine learning from. So once it's built the model, then you can feed it something else you want it to predict. For example, is this person good for a loan or not? For example, should we approve or reject him or her? And the model will then come up with a decision based on the data. Now, if that person's rejected on their loan, then they might want to know why. And because the AI is just fed lots of data, we don't know. It's difficult to unpick exactly why that person's been rejected for the loan. So you've got this black box. And in a regulated industry, obviously that's really, really important because you need that transparency. People need to understand these things. So that's one of the risks, and we can come back to how some of these can be mitigated later on. Another one is around bias, and this is probably the most prevalent risk, I think, in AI at the moment. Comes about for a number of reasons, but the data that's being fed into the model needs to be as balanced as possible. So there's classic example. So there was a database called Labeled Faces in the Wild. It still exists, but this was about 4 or 5 years ago. It was a data set of lots and lots of people's faces. And people like Google and Facebook, etc., would use it to train their facial recognition algorithms on it. Now, if you look at that data set, it was something like, if I remember off the top of my head, 83% of the faces in that data set were white and 79% were male. That is not a representative sample of society. So if you are a woman of color, that system is going to be less accurate for you than if you are a white man. And so that's bias that's baked into that system. And the challenge is, with AI, once you've trained the system, those biases are baked in. And people built this and they trained their algorithms, and for a while nobody challenged this, which is the thing. So why didn't people challenge it? Because the people using the systems, the people that designed the systems, were white men generally. So this is the problem. So again, we can go into how to mitigate these things, but understanding your data set and the data you're feeding in is really, really important. I think another important risk that people don't pick up on is the naivety of AI. So people think, particularly if they watch too many movies, that AI has lots of capabilities that it just doesn't have. They anthropomorphize AI into something that it will be able to do lots of things. At the end of the day, AI is just clever maths. That's all it is. So when, for example, I get an AI system to recognize a picture of a dog, it doesn't know what a dog is. It's just matching patterns of pixels that it's been trained on that somebody's labeled dog with patterns of pixels of another picture that somebody wants to understand what it is, and it says this pattern of pixels closely matches this pattern of pixels, therefore, because you've labeled those dogs, I'm going to label it a dog as well, with a certain level of confidence. What the AI doesn't understand is a dog is an animal, it's a living thing, humans can own them as pets, all these sorts of things, all the relationships that you and I would understand about a dog, the AI doesn't do. So we've got to be really careful we don't give the AI more capabilities than it should do.
And so with the complexity of artificial intelligence, do you think there's a gap in the understanding as well? Because it is actually quite a broad phrase, isn't it? AI can cover things from natural language processing to, machine learning, as we've mentioned already, but they also have different degrees of intrusion or impact.
Yes.
So do you feel that this is clearly described more broadly in business or beyond?
People don't understand what AI is. I mean, generally people, the man in the street, the man on the Clapham omnibus doesn't really understand what AI is. And as I said before, it's very clever maths, it's very complex maths, and there's not many people that really understand kind of the real detail of that. And that's a big challenge, because if you're a business person and you are putting the future of your business in the hands of some algorithms that you don't understand how they work, then that's a risk in itself. So, but even if you don't know the how to code these algorithms, how to build the algorithms, at least you should understand the capabilities and the risks of these. And as you said, it's a massive range of different technologies, say from chatbots at one end to predictive analytics at the other, and everything in between. And if you go to that chatbot, natural language processing end of it, there are, even within that, there's different grades of AI, and some would argue that it's not AI at all. A lot of it is very logical, actually, and it might use a tiny bit of NLP to do some work, but actually a lot of it is just basic decision tree working, which is good because it's simpler and people can understand it and it's transparent, but it doesn't really give you a lot of complexity out of that. And at the other end, you've got this really clever machine learning, predictive analytics, etc., which is much more difficult to understand. But the way that, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Executive Guide to Artificial Intelligence. And in that I built a framework for AI. So I was in this position where kind of the more I was reading about AI, the more confused I was getting. I was thinking, business people must have the same thing. And journalists, use a lot of these terms interchangeably: machine learning, intelligent automation, artificial intelligence, cognitive. But all these words have specific meanings, but they kind of throw them around. So I spent a couple of days in a dark room with a wet towel on my head and came up with a framework of how to explain AI and the capabilities of what the AI can do rather than what it is. And I think that's what's important to a business person. So, for example, there's things like image recognition and speech recognition and search, and all those ones are around capturing information. So AI is very good at capturing all that unstructured data like images and speech and written text and making some sense of it. But it's also good at capturing big data as well. So these kind of big data sets like customer behaviors, etc., making some sense of that, putting clustering, finding clusters of correlated data within that. So that's kind of one area. And then once you've captured your data, then you want to understand what is happening with that data. So that's where things like NLP comes in, natural language processing. So you might have done some speech recognition to work out the words somebody's saying, but you still don't know the intent, what they're trying to say. So NLP comes in and works out really the intent of what the person said. And then you've got things like problem solving and prediction. What's going to happen next? You bought that book. Are you going to buy that book, etc.? So those are kind of the main capabilities. And then the final one, which is why something's happening, is the bit that we then move out of the real world and into labs and science fiction. And I put that in there to make the point that all those capabilities I just described are all very narrow capabilities. So AI is very good at doing one thing very well. So if you've got a image recognition model, that can't do speech recognition. Even to the point where if you've got a model that recognizes a picture of dogs, it can't recognize pictures of cats.
So you have expert systems, essentially. So the dog recognition system versus...
Exactly. So very, very narrow capabilities. So if you're building a an overall application, or you've got a problem to solve, then you might use a number of these different capabilities together. But what the brain is very good at is taking all these different capabilities and creating new ideas and new concepts, for example. So for example, if we learnt how to play drafts, or checkers if you're American, and then we wanted to learn to play chess, we can take some of that learning of the drafts. It's on an 8x8 board, it's a checkered board, we move pieces around, etc., and use that to help us to learn to play chess. If you do that with AI, you've got a system that can play drafts, you'd have to wipe its memory and then teach it how to play chess. So, there's challenges there on that. So what AI, again, going back to the risks, when people talk about cognitive understanding, AI doesn't have cognitive understanding. It doesn't understand what that dog is. What the brain's very good at is putting all these ideas together and coming up with new concepts, which AI can't do. So we have to understand the limits of AI within that point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when we talk about risks, certainly in a business sense, the other side of that is accountability.
Yeah.
So you're talking to executives who the buck's going to stop with them.
Yeah.
And if we look at things like you were just describing, whether or not artificial intelligence knows, whether it understands, and you end up with Cyril's Chinese box. So there's, to open that one out a little bit, there's a person in a box and they don't speak Chinese, but a piece of paper comes in say English language. They have some instructions where they can transfer that into Chinese, and then they spit out the result. They don't speak Chinese, they don't understand the translation or the context, but they are essentially translating.
Yes.
So the understanding is minimal in this particular expert system. When things go wrong, where does the accountability lie? Because if the machine doesn't understand, is it down to the developers? I mean, many companies now will also be going to the big players for AI, third-party companies to supply this, because you're probably not going to build your own neural network from scratch. Believe me, it's a recipe for tears. But someone's going to have to foot the bill. So how do you discuss this then with executives when they're a bit concerned about what might happen?
I mean, you're right, it's a huge problem, and the modern equivalent of the Chinese box thing is the trolley problem, where you have, if with autonomous cars, and if an autonomous car crashes into somebody and kills somebody, whose fault is it? Is it
Elon Musk?
Elon Musk, yes, exactly.
Okay,
or the designer of the car, or the software coder, or the person that owns the car, or the car manufacturer, or anybody in that supply chain, or is it everybody in these things? So it's exactly the same problem. And at the moment, there's no real answer to that. People are coming up with answers, and this is the thing that lawyers are tying their heads in knots with at the moment. The regulations will come about, I think when we'll look at that. But from a business point of view, executives need to understand where those risks are in the process, but I think essentially it will all come back to them. They are the directors. Well, assuming they are the directors of the company, anything they do within the business is their responsibility. It will come back to them. So they are duty bound, I think, to have a good enough understanding of what those systems are doing to make sure they understand those risks as well. Again, as I said before, not with understanding the nuances and the coding elements of it, but to have explained to them clearly, this is what the system can do, these are the limitations of the system, and this is where the system can go wrong as well. And with AI, because AI generally works at scale, if things go wrong, they go wrong at scale as well. So this is the big challenge as well. It's worth pointing out as well, there's another interesting risk with AI. You talk about things happening at scale. So it's not, or it could be, a big bang effect if things go wrong. But actually, the more likely scenario is that you build an AI that wants to do something. It's predicting demand, for example, for your business or something, and you trust that AI to give you the answers, and you've tested that model and it works. Then, over time, as the AI has fed more information and it's updating its model, etc., then it might kind of go a little bit off message. You see what I mean? And it just gets we call drift. So the answer drifts and drifts and drifts until at some point, maybe a year or 3 years or 10 years down the line, it's making unethical decisions for you. But you haven't realized we're just doing bit by bit. And if there's a new risk that people are starting to see now, and people are developing tools as well to identify this drift within AI decisions.
Excellent. So, and whilst also combating those who would do wrong with AI. So interesting retraining of data to misidentify things. It's an interesting technology because it can go, well, like most technologies, it has duality.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, at the moment we talk about everyone's trying to do the right thing, wants to use AI for at least
feeling quite optimistic about the world.
Yes, AI for good or at least for profit, but to use it maliciously as well is a whole different ball game. And there's there's a classic example with the Microsoft Tay chatbot a few years ago where it was put out into the wild and retrained by teenagers to be malicious and a Nazi, basically. So that was kind of I think it was a very good example, but they quickly withdrew it and learned very quickly from their lessons. But there are potentially opportunities for people to do adversarial attacks on AI, and there's examples of in image recognition. So again, going back to autonomous cars, they need to recognize signs in the road. Stop signs is a really good example, but academics have done experiments where they can put different shapes and patterns on those stop signs so the car doesn't recognize it as a stop sign, and which is particularly dangerous. So you take that and you can apply it to any different approach within AI, and you've got a very messy situation.
Oh, goodness, the future is going to be complex.
It is.
And so we've talked about executives having certainly a high-level understanding of artificial intelligence, which is very important.
Yes.
How far do you think this goes to teams within an organisation? And does that mean that the HR team needs to understand a little bit about what's going on because they might be involved in the hiring of people, or indeed people who don't feel they have a connection with the technology, but in fact it might have an influence? So is there a need for a culture change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is relevant to any technology. As I said at the beginning, I do work in RPA, robotic process automation, which is very much more impactful on somebody's work because it might replace the work that they do, because it mimics just the transactional work that they do. With AI, the benefits are actually augmenting the people's abilities, so helping them make better decisions within that. So to do that, you've got to be able to trust the AI. So how do you trust it? You've got to understand what it's doing, you've got to test it. So the people that are, I always say AI is useless unless the person is making proper decisions from whatever it is you're predicting, for example. So you are predicting demand. If you've got a spreadsheet with a demand on, if that goes nowhere, then it's worthless. You waste a lot of money. So that has got to be presented to somebody. The data's got to be accurate. It's got to be optimized, and they've got to make real decisions from that. If they're saying, well, that's what the AI is saying, but I think it's this, then either you've wasted your money, or the model's not accurate enough, or you haven't implemented it well enough. That person hasn't got the trust in the system to do that. Having said that, there are, going back to this trust question, there are positions where you don't want to trust the AI completely. You want to have that, as we call, human in the loop approach. So, for example, if you are predicting, there's a really good example in a book called Weapons of Mass Destruction, Cathy O'Neill, predicting child abuse. So a really, really sensitive subject, but one that, if you think, well, actually, if we can do that, that's going to have a really good benefit on society as a whole. And the data that was coming in was all from public sources. So they're looking at how many visits people had done to the doctor, to other, taken other public services, etc. And they're able to predict the outcome for this. But what they didn't realize is that if the people were rich enough, essentially they weren't using public services, so they didn't have the data for them. So it was biased against poverty and for richness on that one. So that was one problem, just going back to data bias. But what you wouldn't want to do is have that system say, right, these particular people are at risk, therefore we're going to send in the social services or whatever it is to do that. You want to have a human in the loop to say, I'm going to review this, I'm going to use my experience, I'm going to look at all the information together, make sure it's unbiased, etc., before I actually make the decision to take action or not take action as well. So having a human in the loop, I think, is a really, really important aspect of all of this.
Mm-hmm. And so when we consider, bias certainly makes headlines because it's also very easily illustrated. And as you say, it divides on areas of like poverty,
Yes.
And also minority groups. These are things that we don't necessarily want to see happening in a society. But do you think that there's enough affordance in our expectations of AI? I mean, the Microsoft chatbot was an awful example of how it can go wrong. It's very public. But do you feel that we forgive enough, or is it just the level of the mistake that takes place? So the chatbot was offensive, certainly, but it may not have had an impact on someone's relationship with their children.
Yes. I think, AI can do lots of really boring things as well. I've done some really interesting work with clients where we're predicting failure of aircon units in telecoms masts. That's really, really valuable to them. But if there's some bias in that data, hopefully there isn't, but if there's some issue with that, it's not going to make the headlines, is it? So what people need, I think these headline grabbing ones are good because it's, as you say, it illustrates the potential risks, but then we need to bring that back down to earth and say, actually, we're doing something quite boring in here, but the risks are still the same. We still got this issue about data bias or transparency, or whatever it might be, that we need to take into account when we're doing it. So I think it all, ironically, these issues, and the Tay one was hopefully harmless to a lot of people, but I think it's a good one to illustrate.
So thinking then, certainly another area of your expertise about automation. What do you feel is the problem with automating things? Bringing robots into a factory workspace on a very black and white view takes away jobs from people who may need it most. So it's a huge concern, and also an economic concern looking at the macro view. But there also appears to be this gap, which we know was coming, a skills gap. What do you feel can be done, I guess, to try and educate or inform people, or indeed help members of society or groups that feel they're threatened by the introduction of more automation?
Ultimately, it comes down to education. The challenge with education is that's a long life cycle, so you have to start very early in that process. My kids are 18 and 21, and so they've just university now, but they didn't do that much computer science at school. It was still, particularly when they're in junior school, there was none there. Secondary school, they were just introducing it, and they had computer science lessons, etc. But this needs to be kind of baked into the education process. And I think things are happening, but very, very slowly. And I think so one of the jobs at risk is accountancy. Computers, not even clever AI, but just traditional IT can do a lot of work that an accountant can do. The very repetitive transactional work that accountants does can be replicated now by machines. Obviously, that leaves some very valuable work accountants could do in assessing this and having their opinions, etc., just as it is with lawyers as well. But I know in schools today and in universities, people are still being encouraged to be accountants. And they still think that the jobs that they, as accountants, they're going to be doing are the same as the ones that the previous generation were doing as well. And those are all lies, because that just won't happen. So why are we still telling people that these are valuable jobs to do and you need to be trained as an accountant? Because it's completely wrong. Same thing with lawyers. Lawyers is even tricky one, I think, and I do quite a bit of work in the legal space as well, so I kind of understand how that happens. And the challenge with becoming a lawyer is a lot of your training as a junior lawyer is doing all that repetitive stuff, even to the point of photocopying stuff, but you're kind of earning your spurs so that at some point in many years' time, you're a partner in the business and you know exactly what you're talking about because you've gone through everything. Again, technology is carving out all that work that a junior lawyer can do, and particularly AI with being able to read contracts, extract data, look at precedents, all that stuff is now very, very doable by AI. So if AI is doing that, how do the lawyers get trained? And again, law schools are still very much on that traditional approach as this is how we go through and train up lawyers. So I think there's a real challenge here. But even lawyers need to learn how to use these tools. They're not traditionally the best people with technology, from my experience. So how do they learn to use these AI tools to their best of their abilities? Because it's going to make them better lawyers, because they don't have to go down to the library and thumb through lots of books and find the precedent for this particular case. That can be presented to them they can search on natural language, get these responses provided to them. How do they know how to do that? Who's going to train them up? So I think there are some progressive law firms that are looking at this, but I know there's still lots and lots of very traditional views around at the moment. So,
do you think though that at least to mollify people some or assuage these fears, that human creativity is a bit more reassuring, certainly in cases of law? Yes. So if you're a practice lawyer, you may have seen so many hundreds of different legal cases. Is it more likely, human beings are very good at making these disparate connections, and we're not entirely sure why ourselves. Yes. Whereas certainly machines work in a very specific way that we tell them.
Yes.
So making those broad connections and understanding law through experience does seem quite important, because they will make that leap that necessarily a machine might not. Yes. Do you think they find that reassuring? Because surely it would take out the... I'm sure it's not boring work, because legal cases affect people's lives. Yes. But certainly the long hours of reading that would be required to build that knowledge and experience, versus a search where you don't necessarily actually learn what you've missed.
Yeah, it's you're right. It's a really interesting question. They don't know what they don't know, and I think it's down to how good the AI systems are. So there is a responsibility for the people that are building those AI systems to make sure that if somebody does search for something, a precedent on a particular case, then they get all the relevant answers, and there's not one case that's missing that might be the one that's going to make the real difference. And maybe the real genius lawyer is the one that said, there was something I read when I was studying, and and pull it out of their memory bank somewhere that actually solves the case or whatever. I think that's a big problem. The other side, and again pulling on a quite a popular example with DeepMind's work with AlphaGo. So as you know, briefly, they built a system to beat the best player in the world at Go. It's about 3 years ago now, and originally they trained it on games of humans versus humans. That's how it learned. And then it started playing itself, and it got better and better until it beat the best player in the world at Go. All great, and that was amazing at the time. But then they built another system called AlphaGo Zero, which they trained without using human games as the training source. So basically, just got one version of AlphaGo Zero to play, another very slightly different version. Started playing each other, and of course at the beginning very rubbish. But got better and better, and because it can play very quickly, got better very quickly. So within a few hours it's better than an amateur, and within a few days it's better than professional, and again it went on to beat the then best player in the world at Go. Again, fascinating stuff. The really interesting thing here is that the AlphaGo Zero started playing moves that humans hadn't seen before. And Go is a very intuitive game to play. It's a 19 by 19 board. There's more possible moves on a Go board than there are atoms in the universe. So very complex game. But the idea that the system, AlphaGo Zero, is coming up with new moves, and human Go players were looking at this saying, I would never thought of playing that move. I'm going to use that and learn from it, is really, really interesting. And you could almost claim that that's creativity if you were thinking hard about it, because it's coming up with something new that a human hadn't done before. So if you take that now to the lawyer's point of view, if you're applying that same idea to a particular case, then maybe the AI system will come up with something that the lawyer hadn't seen before.
It seems interesting that when we talk about artificial intelligence at a business level, we talk about ethics. And we kind of just throw it in there like it's expected. The last time I heard about ethics was probably in a religious studies class, and it was put in there. It wasn't put in my art class. Certainly wasn't in my maths class. Why would there be ethics in maths? That doesn't make any, because it's just cold logic. Do you think that maybe ethics needs to be shifted as well in the education system to match the level of technology that's now being used today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's part of that whole education process, isn't it? I mean, the interesting thing, generalizing on millennials, or even, actually millennials are getting quite old now.
They're long in the tooth.
Yeah, there's the next level below, Gen X, I think it is. Again, I think this is probably when my own children come into that category as well. A lot of people want to work for businesses with a purpose, and this is really, really important to them now. And so understanding the purpose of the business means understanding their ethics. And so their ethics means you have a view or an opinion on what ethics and values are important to you as well. So I think you take that back, then it's really, really important. So one, I think that's an open door for people. And if you had, let's talk about ethics and values in business, I think people would, young people would lap that up because it's really, really important to them. And if you apply that to AI as well, and people doing computer science and all those other studies as well, I think that would be, that would be a really strong message to get across to people. And I think they would, and it'd be an interesting challenge as well, because if young people had this power and this understanding of what these technologies can do, and then they're being interviewed for work, and they're going to be the ones asking the business, what are you going to do about this? Are you environmentally sustainable? Do you have bias systems in place? How do you monitor transparency of your systems? All these things. If the interviewer can't answer those, then they're not going to get the right people for their jobs.
Okay. And so, how far does this spread? I mean, we've talked about automated vehicles, we've talked about law, mathematics somewhat. There's a huge range of areas that artificial intelligence can have an impact. The one area that I find it interesting people feel is protected are the creative industries. However, there are examples. I mean, I enjoy painting. There's only so much work I'm going to be able to do in my lifetime. And then I look at work of someone like, say, Bridget Riley, who was working on colour theory and combination in a very formulated way. Yeah. If I was Bridget Riley, would I be interested in automating my work? I mean, she had a studio. So as it was, other people were doing this. So we're heading down that route a little bit. Would it be disappointing? Mind you, it probably wouldn't be disappointing if we found out Leonardo da Vinci had invented AI, because maybe he did, who knows? But, are there areas where, in fact, this is beneficial, but seems like a really strange match?
Yes. So, and there are examples in the art world of AI, or art that has been created by AI that have been sold at Christie's and Sotheby's for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of those are paintings, some of them are digital images, etc. And it goes back to the thing, art is what people call art. It doesn't really matter. And if somebody says this is art, then it is. But it is challenging the whole way that art is created. And it's interesting. These systems, going back to the autonomous cars and who's got the responsibility again, who's the creator in that artwork, because there is somebody that's actually created the neural network, for example, that's created that image, etc. So are they the real artist, or are you calling the AI the artist? And you may have heard there's University of Surrey are challenging patent law. So they've in the US, there's an AI system that has actually made some inventions. It's really interesting. One of them, off the top of my head, is a light that's used in emergencies, and it flashes in synchronization in the same cycle as a human brain cycle. Electrons fire, apparently. So if the light flashes, you immediately take much more notice of that light than other flashing lights. So in an emergency, it's particularly good. The AI apparently has come up with this idea. So the University of Surrey taken this and said, we want to on behalf of the AI, patent this idea. And of course, in UK patent law, it must be a human that is the patent holder, so they're challenging that whole concept of that. But it is getting to the point, well, who is the creator of that invention? Is it the person that's created the AI, or is it the actual AI? Because if you created, you create one model, it's created 1,000 different inventions, which is feasible, then that's a lot of work that's being created out of that.
It sounds like a new role, human advocates for machines.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. It does. So some would say it kind of downgrades the role of the human in this whole thing. If you look at it from a glass half full point of view, it's actually the AI is augmenting that human's capabilities, because that human who's created a neural network that's done this has now created 1,000 inventions. So that it depends which way you look at it. There's other examples in the field of music as well, where people are using AI to create music or augment their own music as well. Some of it's it's a matter of opinion, of course, but some of it's good, some of it's less good. But again, from a copyright point of view, who owns the copyright of those sorts of things as well, and those are being challenged as well. So it's a brave new world we're entering in, and lots of people, these are questions that I'm not sure people know the answers to. One thing I do know is that the law and regulations are going to move a lot slower than the technology is going to be advancing, and this is the big challenge. So when we're talking about going back to the start of the conversation, transparency in regulated industries, the regulators are constantly catching up, and as soon as they catch up, then the technology advances even further as well. So this is the big problem that we're going to have. We just can't keep up with the technology as it advances.
And so, in thinking about government and legislation, it does feel like certainly in the UK there have been some moves toward comprehension. Yes. And understanding, and certainly transparency is one of the key areas where the Information Commissioner's Office have been looking at how best to manage AI for wider society and for businesses as well.
And within GDPR, a person has a right to be assessed by a human rather than a system as well. Yeah. So there is some regulations in place.
Exactly, and it seems there's some surprises in the research as well, areas that you may think will be very sensitive, like medical decisions. Does this person get a new kidney? Where it seemed like accuracy was needed more over explanation.
Yes.
And that division, I think, is going to be something that plagues artificial intelligence for a long time yet, is the explanation, as you say, the black box.
Yes, yeah.
But it also appears that, society, almost like a brain, has a plasticity where it will reform itself, to make sure we can get things done. Do you feel that as understanding grows, hopefully, that also our acceptance of decision-making AI may also be balanced in a way? Do you think that we kind of accept a bit more of this? Or because the sci-fi dystopia is that we're going to have riots in the streets and we're going to be fighting machines and the robots will take over the world.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to get that.
No, I think we're all a bit too comfortable for that kind of war. So what do you see ahead of us then? As this, as we pointed out, it's very messy.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Going back to the transparency point of view, there are mitigations against that, and very generally, the more complex the algorithms you're using, the more opaque they become. So you can kind of roll back and use simpler algorithms, which are going to be more transparent. But actually, technology is getting better in doing the explainability piece as well. So there's actually techniques for kind of reverse engineering the decisions that the algorithms made. So this is relatively new over past 6 or 12 months. People are coming up with these things. So this isn't a static conversation. So it may be within a year's time, actually the black box problem's gone away completely. It just may happen. But right now you're able to say, again, going back to the loan example, although you won't say, well, it's because of your postcode. Actually, it might be 20% due to your postcode and 15% due to your salary and 10% due to your age and all these sorts of things as well. But you'll get a much better feel for why you've been rejected for that particular loan. to kind of the wider philosophical question, I think, again, as people get more used to the technologies, and we know that, children are essentially born with phones in their hands now, so they're much more acceptable to this sort of thing. Maybe they won't ask for those explanations in the future. Maybe they are going to be more trusting in the AI, which is obviously a huge risk, and they need that education about how they are. But if we can get to the point where we do, for example, have that transparency, then that goes away and we don't need to worry about that. And if we can solve the bias question, which will be a mixture of technology and understanding and just different processes and having better gender balance within teams and all those sorts of things as well, which we're seeing more and more of. So again, maybe that's going to become a non-problem in the future, that we can then move to this point when, yes, you're accepted or rejected for a loan. You go, oh, okay, computer said no, literally, and you just accept it because you know that if you did ask, you get a good explanation for it, and you know that the data is unbiased.
Okay, and so finally, I have two questions related. So I'm the executive of a multinational, highly successful business, of course, and my CTO is trying to convince me that I need a technology that I'm not really sure about. It's a fringe technology. Yeah. It's, I don't understand artificial intelligence or why I might need this. To what level do I need to know this? Can I trust my CTO instead? I don't understand how the machines work on the factory floor, but I know that they've boosted my profits and that my company's relatively happy. Everyone's getting paid. Yes. And, where do I then begin? Yeah. Like if I'm just starting cold and I'm being told my business needs this thing and I just really don't know about it, what do I do? Yeah.
So I think, as I said before, it's that understanding. So try and understand it to at least the reasonable level of what the technology is, down to just the capabilities. So again, not what it is, but what it does. Having that will help enormously. But then it's going to understanding the risks. So if you talk about physical robots on a factory floor, what's the worst thing that can happen? What are the risks within those robots? Well, they could go out of control and hit somebody, but they're not going to walk out of the business with all your data. They might break down, etc. So how do you make sure you got the right predictive maintenance programs in place, all that sort of stuff. So and if one robot goes down, it doesn't necessarily mean all robots are going to go down, but maybe there's a bug in the software. So you've got to look at all these different risks and kind of what's the worst thing that can happen, just as you do any risk assessment. With AI, do exactly the same thing, but you've got to understand that potentially the risks are greater because, as I said before, if it goes wrong, it's the potential to go wrong at scale as well. And that might be all your systems go down, or that you get yourself into an unethical situation, or a situation where you're being challenged in court because you've got biased algorithms, those sorts of things as well. So understanding all that at the beginning is really, really important. The CTO is probably not necessarily the best person for that. They will definitely have an opinion. CIO maybe, but having somebody in the business, or consultants obviously, to assess and understand those risks, I think is really, really important. From and I always think of them in three levels. There's that strategic piece, the top level. Should we be investing in autonomous weapons? Those sorts of big questions, or tobacco, those sorts of things, etc. There's the operational piece of, do we have a balanced team that's building these algorithms, those sorts of things. And then there's a technical bit at the bottom, which is those, is the algorithm transparent enough? Is it unbiased? And is it doing all the right things from a very technical point of view as well? So maybe the CEO can start to answer those strategic questions, but the technical questions, maybe that's the CTO and some data scientists that you have. The middle bit is probably the bit that's the most, the one that's ignored the most, I think, and that's the one that you probably need to kind of really focus on.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think then that there's a role for AI architects to oversee this at a C-suite level?
Yeah, definitely. I think you need to have that involvement. Again, it's like, what are you using AI for? If it's just you've got a chatbot, then there are risks with using chatbots, but it's mainly reputational risk if they go wrong or they don't do the right thing. But if you've got a model in there that's running some part of your business from a fundamental level, then you do need to understand that from a board point of view. So having somebody that can explain that at that level, I think, is really important.
Excellent, Ryan. Well, thank you very much for explaining all of this to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.